Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. If you're someone who loves taking complex, global mechanics and breaking them down into clear, easy-to-grasp concepts, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating intersection of economics and global power. We're going to uncover the hidden mechanics of geopolitics, but not through the usual lens of military might. No, we're looking at this through the lens of currency, specifically the phenomenal rise and the absolute reign of the US dollar.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because we live in a rather crazy modern paradox. If you look at global affairs today, you'll start to see a recurring theme. Crossing the United States economically can often devastate a nation much faster, and sometimes a lot more thoroughly, than a direct military strike. Now you might be wondering, why is that? Why does a piece of paper hold the same, if not more, geopolitical weight than a nuclear arsenal? How did one single nation's currency become the inescapable center of gravity for the entire global economy?
To answer that, here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. From barter to paper. 2. The Bretton Woods system. 3. The 1971 Nixon shock. 4. Birth of the petrodollar. 5. The ultimate financial weapon. And finally 6. Can the dollar be dethroned?
All right, kicking things off with Chapter 1, From Barter to Paper, the evolution of global trade.
Look, trade started out pretty simply with the basic barter system. You trade wheat for tomatoes. Simple, right? But goods perish. So humanity naturally shifted to valuable, non-perishable metals like gold and silver, which the Lydians eventually standardized into coins. But there was a major issue. Carrying crates of heavy gold on dangerous trade routes was incredibly risky. So an ingenious solution emerged. Merchants started leaving their heavy gold in trusted vaults, and they'd get a stamped piece of paper in return proving they owned it. The Chinese formalized this system in the 11th century, and Marco Polo famously brought the idea back to Europe in the 13th century. By the 19th century, the UK, totally fueled by its massive production and global trade, hoarded immense gold reserves. Their paper currency, the pound sterling, became the undisputed global standard, handling about 60% of all world trade.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the Bretton Woods system, the dollar's coronation. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the shift. The 20th century brought two absolutely devastating world wars. And while Europe was buried in debt and physically in ruins, the US was largely untouched at home and massively enriched by supplying weapons, food, and resources to everyone else. This brings us to a really staggering number: 70%. By the end of the Second World War, the US literally held 70% of the entire world's gold reserves. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 22,000 tons of gold sitting in American vaults. The global financial system was essentially destroyed, and the US was standing as the ultimate economic survivor.
So, to prevent a total global collapse, 700 representatives from 34 countries gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. Since the rest of the world was basically out of gold, the US proposed a brand new system. Instead of every country backing their own currency with their own gold, they would back their currencies with the US dollar. And the US guaranteed that anyone could exchange their dollars for American gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Effectively, the whole world swapped the gold standard for the dollar standard. And the US brilliantly solidified this new reality through what's known as the Marshall Plan. They loaned out over $13.3 billion US dollars, which was a monumental sum back then, to reconstruct a war-torn Europe. But here was the catch. The loans were in dollars, they had to be paid back in dollars, and those dollars were largely used to buy rebuilding materials straight from American companies. Just like that, the US dollar transformed from a foreign currency into a universal, everyday necessity for global survival.
Moving on to Chapter 3, the 1971 Nixon shock, the dollar's crisis.
Let's fast forward a bit to the late 1960s. The US had essentially printed way more paper dollars than they actually had physical gold in their vaults to back them up. Realizing this, other countries started getting pretty nervous and demanded their physical gold back in exchange for their paper dollars. The US gold reserves began plummeting. So, faced with a total depletion of American gold, President Richard Nixon made a drastic move on August 15, 1971. Through Executive Order 11615, he announced to the world that the US dollar would no longer be convertible into physical gold. This completely severed the dollar's tie to any tangible asset.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer panic that followed. Think of it like a global bounce check. Imagine signing millions of checks, handing them out to people all over the world, and then suddenly announcing, yeah, actually, you can never cash these at the bank. I mean, imagine the customer service calls on that one. Nations were suddenly holding billions in completely unbacked paper.
It became known as the Nixon shock, and the world was left scrambling, wondering what actual value the dollar even held anymore.
So how did they fix it? Chapter 4, Birth of the Petrodollar, the Master Pivot.
The US knew that without gold backing, the dollar could totally collapse just like the pound sterling did before it. So they executed an absolutely ingenious adaptation. To save the dollar, they tied their currency to the literal lifeblood of the modern industrial world, oil. Back in 1945, the US and Saudi Arabia had struck a foundational agreement. Step 1. The US provided vital oil extraction tech and unmatched military security to the Saudi kingdom. Step 2. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to price and sell its massive oil reserves exclusively in US dollars. No other currency allowed. Step 3. The excess billions of dollars Saudi Arabia made were then funneled right back into American bonds, banks, and companies.
This whole setup created what we call the petrodollar. Because every single nation on Earth needed oil to survive and grow, every single nation was now forced to hold massive reserves of US dollars just to buy that oil. This one brilliant mechanism kept the US dollar universally relevant, incredibly powerful, and constantly cycling back into the American economy. It completely replaced the need for a gold standard.
Let's move to Chapter 5 and see how this builds into the ultimate financial weapon, controlling geopolitics.
So, because the whole world was now transacting in dollars, the very infrastructure of global finance effectively became an extension of U.S. influence. Enter the SWIFT network. Now, SWIFT isn't a bank. It's a highly secured messaging system that tells banks across the world exactly where to move money. While it has thousands of global shareholders, the source material points out that it operates under heavy U.S. influence. Getting banned from SWIFT means a country literally can no longer send or receive money internationally. The sources actually refer to this as having a financial nuclear bomb dropped on a country's economy.
The U.S. leverages this power heavily through sanctions, which generally come in two flavors. Primary sanctions mean U.S. companies and citizens are banned from doing business with a target nation. That definitely hurts, but secondary sanctions, that is where the true power lies. This means the U.S. will punish any foreign country or company anywhere in the world that dares to trade with the sanctioned nation. It essentially isolates the target from the entire global economy purely out of fear of U.S. retaliation.
Now, the source material highlights a pretty stark historical correlation regarding nations that tried to circumvent this dollar dominance in the oil trade. For example, the sources note Saddam Hussein of Iraq attempted to sell oil in euros before he was overthrown. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya proposed a unified African currency prior to his ouster, and Iran faced severe, isolating sanctions right after attempting to establish an oil board based on the euro. According to the text we're exploring, moving away from the dollar has historically carried immense geopolitical risks.
But why does this actually matter to you and me? Well, it's the ripple effect. When these massive financial weapons are deployed, they don't just hurt the target country in a vacuum. They disrupt entire global supply chains. They cause global inflation. They spike the price of oil everywhere. This means even totally neutral nations, like India or countries in South America, end up paying the price through higher fuel costs and economic instability, even if they have absolutely nothing to do with the original conflict.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 6, Can the Dollar Be Dethroned? The Modern Pushback. Because of the heavy, unilateral use of these financial weapons in recent years, especially the severe sanctions placed on major global players like Russia, a real shockwave of unease has passed through the global community, and it's sparked a movement known as de-dollarization. Now, just to be clear, experts note that completely dropping the US dollar overnight is pretty much impossible right now. The world's financial plumbing is just far too deeply intertwined with it. However, nations are actively and aggressively working to minimize their exposure and their reliance on the dollar.
So the crucial point here is that this isn't just a theory anymore. It's happening right now. We are seeing China actively reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. We see massive oil players like Iraq and Saudi Arabia testing the waters by agreeing to trade some oil in Chinese yuan. India and the UAE have actually signed agreements to trade using their own local currencies, bypassing the dollar exchange entirely. And Russia is now keeping its oil profits in yuan reserves.
One of the most prominent potential alternatives emerging from this pushback is the idea of a unified BRICS currency, championed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The theory here is that rather than relying on one single nation's fiat money, they could create a shared currency based on a weighted system of the member nations' collective economic power. It's conceptually somewhat similar to the special drawing rights used by the IMF.
So what does this all mean? Well, we are left with this massive, unresolved question. Will a unified BRICS currency, or perhaps the rise of the Chinese yuan, finally be the thing that dethrones the US dollar? Or is the infrastructure of global wealth, oil, and debt
simply tied too deeply to American power to ever truly break free. The history of money is literally still being written, and the next chapter is unfolding right in front of us. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.